Teddy Roosevelt is best known for securing America's natural wonders, a progressive Republican who believed in the common man. But there was a romantic side to the Rough Rider that CBS's own Mary Calvi is bringing to light. Calvi has ventured to the past before on her first historical fiction book, Dear George, Dear Mary, piecing together the relationship between George Washington and Mary Phillips through preserved documents. Her latest novel paints a picture of a young Theodore through real letters to and from his first love, who she believes helped influence him in his early years.
We are following three big stories.
When she's not delivering the news of the day.
Now to meetings between the presidents of China and Russia.
WCBS anchor Mary Calvi is seeking truths from our past.
What is your fascination with history? Where does that stem from?
You know, I think as journalists, we want to find the exclusive, whether it be today or 150 years ago. And it drives me, and especially when it comes to a woman's voice that needs to be heard.
Her latest subject, love letters between Alice Hathaway Lee.
I do love this one here. This is written by Alice, and she starts out, "My dearest Teddykins."
And our Bull Moose president.
Every letter is written to Teddy, which is interesting because Teddy Roosevelt didn't like to be called Teddy, although he clearly loved it from her.
We met up at Theodore Roosevelt's birthplace in New York City.
Did your view of Teddy Roosevelt change?
Oh, yes. I mean, I had no idea. This man was a romantic. He's writing things like, "I worship you so that it seems desecration to touch you.
No.
I can hardly let you a moment out of my arms, my purest queen." Theodore Roosevelt was a passionate man.
Calvi's new novel, If a Poem Could Live and Breathe, is not just a fictional take on the romance between Theodore Roosevelt and his first wife, but a deduction on her influence on him.
Discovering these love letters that had not been published before was really what set the stage for the novel. Here these were, hiding in plain sight. They had been donated decades before, and really they have not had their time in the limelight.
She found them by following the women in the family.
They were in the family papers of Alice Roosevelt Longworth, their daughter. Nobody thought to look at the women's side of the story.
Previous biographies had not been kind to Alice Lee.
One biographer calls her uncomplicated, bland, incapable of spiritual growth, and says that if Alice had stayed in Theodore Roosevelt's life, he may have committed suicide from sheer boredom.
Calvi thought otherwise.
She crashed the gender barrier, went into an all-male social club at Harvard. Women did not do these things. She attended his boxing matches. I believe she was pushing him further to understand women's rights.
Calvi contends his speech at Harvard's commencement in 1880 may have won her over.
His first line, "I think there can be no question that women should have equal rights with men." He was calling for women to be lawyers. He was saying that women should keep their name upon marriage. He often talks, too, in this speech about what happens after marriage.
They married months later, and he entered the New York State Assembly. They seemed blissfully happy. But then in February 1884, he would receive her final letter. "I'm feeling well tonight," she said, "but I am very much worried about your little mother. Her fever is still very high, and I'm afraid it might be typhoid." Her suspicion was correct.
Teddy Roosevelt arrives at the house, and his brother answers the door and says, "Your mother is dying, and your wife is dying too." And so he rushes in, sees his mother before she takes her last breath, and rushes up to be with his Alice, and she dies in his arms.
His 22-year-old wife died of kidney disease on Valentine's Day. She had given birth to their daughter just 2 days before. Roosevelt buried his mother and wife side by side at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York.
When Alice dies, Theodore Roosevelt very famously writes a large X in his diary and writes, "The light has gone out of my life." You can see down here is Alice.
Ed O'Keefe is CEO of the Theodore
Edith,
Roosevelt
you wanna talk
Presidential
about
Library Foundation.
He was demonstrably depressed. He quit his job in the New York State Assembly after finishing his term, and he went to the Badlands of North Dakota. Yes, to become a rancher and a cowboy and to live what he would later call the strenuous life. But he went there to recover.
It shaped his vision for this nation.
When he is President of the United States, he preserves 230 million acres of land. He establishes 5 national forests. He establishes the first bird preserves. At the time, remember, this is a revolutionary idea.
Roosevelt later married his childhood sweetheart, Edith Caro, who became a definitive First Lady.
She's the first to have a social secretary and establishes that tradition. She oversees the entire renovation of the White House. She's Theodore Roosevelt's key advisor. She will sit in on cabinet meetings and be a part of pretty much every major decision that he makes correctly.
O'Keefe hopes history will honor all of the women who influenced this indelible figure.
Sounds like he was incredibly lucky in finding the right woman for the right time.
TR, perhaps ahead of his time, sadly, was someone who really loved, respected, and appreciated women's opinions, and that too has to be credited to Alice and to Edith.
For Calvi, finding the new in what's old is an art in and of itself.
So you have a Teddy quote at the top of the book. I have never done anything to deserve such good fortune. After losing her, do you think he ever regretted loving at all, this woman?
That's such a question, isn't it? I don't see Theodore Roosevelt as that passionate, romantic man in his letter writing to other women, after Alice. Did he regret loving Alice? I believe not, because I believe it took him to the pinnacle of love that any man could experience. And if he had not had that, it may have been a different Theodore Roosevelt after Alice.
Donald Trump's election victory places him in a rare category of American presidents. Only one other chief executive has served 2 non-consecutive terms. For the other, you have to go back 132 years when voters returned Grover Cleveland to the White House. Aside from his unique status, Cleveland doesn't stand out among America's presidents. But in one community in America, Grover Cleveland is more than just a name in the history books. Scott McFarlane takes us there.
You're looking at one of America's most humble, historic sites, the birthplace of one of just 14 men to ever serve 8 years as U.S. president. And yes, it's across the street from a gas station and a donut shop. This house in Caldwell, New Jersey, about 20 miles outside of New York, is where Grover Cleveland was born, near the Presbyterian church where his dad was pastor. Sharon Farrell has been the tour guide here since 1980.
This was the family parlor. This is where all of the activity took place.
Cleveland was America's 22nd president, and its 24th president, too. The first president to ever win a rematch after losing the White House. Nationwide, there is little to mark this unique presidency, other than a rest area off the New Jersey Turnpike. Caldwell also has the Grover Cleveland Apartments and Grover Cleveland Park, Middle School, even this parking spot. But Cleveland is beloved here in Caldwell, including by Carlos Pomares, who says 130 years later, Cleveland was his inspiration to run for the local county commission.
Sure did. How could you not be inspired? The guy had this meteoric rise in a matter of 4 years based on just being a hard worker, honest, brutally honest at times, and being one who just stuck to his beliefs.
You think he was principled?
Absolutely.
Let's see what you got. Let's pull the first one out.
Pomares' home is filled with Cleveland historic pieces. Ribbons, busts, and that is a Grover Cleveland brandy bottle.
It's got the cork in it still.
But outside of Caldwell, this unparalleled president is relatively unknown.
Grover Cleveland is one of the strangest stories in terms of somebody getting to the White House. I always think the most interesting place to start with Cleveland is in the middle of his life.
Troy Senek is author of A Man of Iron, a life story of Cleveland.
If you go to the year 1881, that's the year he turns 44, and you found Grover Cleveland, you would find a boring, balding, unmarried, work-a-day lawyer in Buffalo, living in a little apartment above his law practice. The only reason that any of this is interesting is I'm describing to you somebody who's 3 years away from becoming the President of the United States.
Cleveland, the fifth of 9 children in a middle-class family, parlayed a law career in New York into becoming mayor of Buffalo and briefly governor of New York. Viewed as principled and ethical, Cleveland was drafted by Democratic Party bosses to run for president amid an era of corruption, patronage, and unethical power brokers. He won, making history, but not headlines.
If you're looking at the late 19th century, if you're looking at the Gilded Age, the debates are about tariffs. They're about silver in the money supply. They're about pensions for Union veterans. We don't know how to think about any of these things.
That's not exciting stuff.
It's not exciting stuff.
He began as a rare bachelor president. His White House wedding to a friend's daughter, 27 years younger than him, was a spectacle.
They were married in the Blue Room of the White House. John Philip Sousa led the band. And
Big event.
Yeah, it was ships' bells went off, whistles went off, church bells were chiming.
Cleveland lost his re-election race to Indiana Republican Benjamin Harrison in 1888, despite winning the popular vote, and he was initially content with retirement.
He was somewhat relieved. He felt that he had done a decent job in his first term.
Until he was pressed by his party leaders to run again in 1892 and narrowly vanquished his old rival, Harrison, and moved back into 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. While Donald Trump has now equaled Cleveland's accomplishment, Seneck warns other than both being New Yorkers and disliking the press, the two men couldn't be more different.
They really occupy very different places in their parties because you have Cleveland fighting this rearguard to keep the Democratic Party from changing. And Trump is on the opposite side of this equation. He is leading the populist insurgency in the Republican Party. So Trump's a revolutionary. Cleveland is a counter-revolutionary.
Though Cleveland's new First Lady foreshadowed the comeback in the final days of her husband's first term.
She tells a member of the domestic staff in the White House, make sure that you pack up everything very carefully because we want it to be just where we remember it when we come back. And the staffer assumes that they're planning some visit in the Harrison administration. Says, Mrs. Cleveland, when will that be? She said, we're coming back 4 years from today.
Cleveland's second victory came just weeks before the start of an economic panic and crisis. It crippled the nation and consumed Cleveland's second term.
It was the worst thing the country had seen up to that time.
In his first year?
In his first year back. So he has this window of good luck that is just small enough to get him back to the presidency. And it does not stay with him during his second term.
Pomerantz says Cleveland may not have made a dent in the history books, but he made Washington a more honest place.
Why does nobody else talk about him?
Because he wasn't flashy. he wasn't a about me kind of guy.
For CBS Saturday Morning, Scott McFarland, Caldwell, New Jersey.
You know, I live not far from there. A lot of times I go right by. But it was so interesting about Grover Cleveland. You know, his real name was Stephen. He was a teacher. He was a distant cousin of the guy who Cleveland, Ohio is named after. But, you know, there was a bit of a scandal about him, too, and whether or not he fathered an illegitimate child. And, you know, that's something I can relate to. He said no, but interesting to be an honest guy and be like scandalized in a way in that second.
I just appreciate the history lesson on so many things. Before that, the most I knew about him, I'll admit, was the Michael Douglas reference in the movie The American President when he's talking about the last time there was someone in office who did not have a wife at the time. If you don't know the reference, look up the movie. Great movie.
Love that movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Some of the highest cost tickets in the history of theater might end up being from a show that never finished.
They stopped the show cold.
They stopped the show cold. The theater's taken over by the Army. There's an undercurrent of wanting to destroy this place, so there are literally soldiers out front, armed soldiers protecting it.
Ford's Theater Deputy Director Jake Flack is referring to the April 14, 1865 showing of Our American Cousin, which was Our American Tragedy. Days after the end of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln sought to celebrate by taking in a show here. John Wilkes Booth learned about it, plotted, and shot Lincoln, who was unguarded in the theater's presidential box. Booth barreled down to the stage and fled, as park ranger Garrett Koss describes.
All of a sudden, you have chaos unfolding here in the crowd. People on the first floor are clambering up onto the stage to get after Booth and to also get up into that box.
At auction this week, Bobby Livingston's auction company is selling a pair of tickets preserved for more than 158 years from that show. Bids are already in the 5 figures.
Section D, and these tickets were actually in the front row, where you would have been able to witness John Wilkes Booth escaping from the president's box.
Even though Ford's Theater can't itself vouch for the ticket's authenticity, the auction of these stubs draws the same type of interest that lures 500,000 visitors a year to tour this national attraction. To see the Lincoln presidential box, which remains untouched and off limits, and learn how the assassination transformed and traumatized the nation.
And celebrate who we think is our greatest president, who ushered the country really through the hardest time in our nation's history.
Ford's Theater remains an active theater with nearly 150 shows a year and tens of thousands of visitors as they seek to write new, additional chapters to their history. For CBS Saturday Morning, Scott McFarland, Washington.
Throughout American history, we have looked to our presidents to lead us. They all have faced challenges, with a handful making momentous decisions that defined what kind of democracy we would be. Barry Peterson takes a look at those critical turning points in our presidential history that shaped the America we live in today.
It is the never-forgotten anthem of the Civil War, but Abraham Lincoln thought his words would soon be forgotten. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
No one had any idea of the severity, the degree of casualties, the length of the conflict that was to come. It was simply unfathomable.
Susan Schulten is a professor of history at the University of Denver.
The South creates its own separate country, the Confederacy. Why didn't Lincoln just say, okay, we'll just go our separate ways?
Lincoln is reared in a country where the founders are still very live, heroes, very immediate, and he thinks of himself as very much an American to the core.
At this turning point, America's fate turns on one man's faith in one cause, the Union.
Union is what makes the identity of an American possible. In other words, union is the precondition for freedom. And without that, of course, he says, disunion, secession is anarchy.
Nearly 7 decades later, there was a new American anthem for a new American president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected in the midst of the Great Depression.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
But behind the scenes, another dark turning point was brewing. A campaign by top officials and journalists urging Roosevelt to make himself a dictator, arguing that such a desperate move was the only way to survive such a desperate time.
The United States was essentially curled up in the fetal position on March 4th, 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt was sworn in as president. The banks were closed. Mostly, he would close the remainder a couple of days later. The official unemployment rate was 25%, but it didn't include women. If you included them, it was more like 50%.
Jonathan Alter is a journalist and historian who has interviewed 9 of the last 10 American presidents.
Why didn't he just give them what they wanted? It would have been so much easier for him and so much more power for him.
He let that cup pass because ultimately he believed in democracy. See, this is really the threshold question. Do you believe in our system or not?
Once again, America turned on the character of one man, making one decision.
Ultimately, he chose to use his great powers of persuasion, the power of his character, the power of his leadership, instead of dictatorial power.
Then came another era of American upheaval.
It was picked up and thrown back.
Sometimes violent anti-Vietnam War protests. And when President Richard Nixon was accused of obstruction of justice during Watergate, he resigned, succeeded by his vice president, Gerald Ford.
A full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
Ford pardoned Nixon, protecting Nixon from numerous criminal trials. Ford knew it could cost him the presidency, and it did.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
He lost to Jimmy Carter.
There had been such distrust over Watergate and Vietnam and assassinations.
But Douglas Brinkley, professor of history at Rice University, says that their shared religious beliefs were exactly the healing America needed at exactly the moment America needed it.
This was really, in its own way, a turning point in American history then. We were jaded, we didn't believe in our presidents, there were riots on the streets, and Ford, and then after him, Carter, somehow seemed able to heal that. How?
I think both Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter both had God in their life. Gerald Ford used to have prayer sessions on Capitol Hill. They are the kind of men we'd like to believe should be president if you're looking for the idea that character matters. Those two had a character that you cannot besmirch.
Many call the January 6th insurrection a turning point in our times, an effort to overturn a presidential election. Jonathan Holloway is president of Rutgers University and an historian of African American culture, who saw a sinister message aimed at Black America.
What went through your mind when you saw the Confederate flag being waved inside the U.S. Capitol?
I understand that people declare that this is a flag that speaks about tradition, speaks about culture. Okay. But other people who have my background in this country, African Americans, see that often as a flag of treason or a flag of terror, certainly a flag of threat.
Threat personally?
Personally.
Alter sees a different threat in our times. His newest book is American Reckoning, written after he attended every day of Donald Trump's felony hush money trial, which gives Alter insight when Trump insists he would not be a dictator except on day one.
We are at a significant turning point, pivot point, inflection point, however you want to describe it. And the problem is, once you put power in the hands of an autocrat, you don't get it back.
Douglas Brinkley has a more hopeful outlook.
We're going to have to look at where all of this hate speech, brutality, dehumanizations emanating from. But I never give up on the United States' ability to retake the higher ground, because we do it all the time. We've done it all the time.
Which is what the national anthem reminds us of, that the Founding Fathers believed America's fate can be trusted to we, the people. For CBS Saturday Morning, Barry Peterson, Denver.
That's a powerful message. It's incredible how Barry laid out the turning points, because it makes the point that the American democracy, it's a social experiment. It gets improved, it gets damaged, but it requires people generation after generation to get involved.
Get out and vote. I didn't know with FDR that they had wanted him to take over as in a dictatorship in that role.
Yeah.
That it was that choice to believe in democracy and the character mattering so much. Fascinating
Don't take
stuff.
it for granted.
Yeah, go and vote.
Thank you for that, Barry. Great story.
Lee H. Oswald, the 24-year-old man whom Dallas police say is a prime suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy, was questioned for 6 hours at the Dallas police station this evening. He was arrested shortly after the assassination and has been under questioning ever since. But as he was led from the interrogation room upstairs in the Dallas police station, perhaps reporters say for booking, he said to reporters, "I don't know anything about this. I haven't done anything." Apparently, he is still denying any knowledge.
This coming Wednesday will mark 60 years since the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. As CBS's Walter Cronkite tried to keep the nation informed, he relied on other journalists on the ground. Now, a key artifact that captured that part of history is going on display in Dallas. Omar Villafranca has the story.
Just a moment. Here is Oswald at the police station.
12 hours after President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas, reporters from all over the world were crammed into police headquarters, trying to interview the suspect, Lee Harvey Oswald.
I got jostled. I'm small, so I got pushed behind the door one time.
I'm pummeled. This is a situation now.
Bill Mercer was a reporter with CBS station KRLD. He just got a tip from a cop that Oswald had formerly been charged with murdering the president, something that Oswald didn't even know until Mercer broke the news to him on camera.
You have been
Nobody
charged.
said what?
Sir? You have been
Nobody
charged.
said what? Okay.
You have been charged with the murder of the president. Wow. And he looked at me, what? And I said, you have been charged with the murder of the president. So that was my greatest interview in television.
Almost 60 years later, camera number 3 from that interview is on display in its new home at Dallas's 6th floor museum, which chronicles the JFK assassination.
Oh my gosh, there it is.
And earlier this year, 97-year-old Mercer was reunited with that piece of history.
This is particularly special because we have the footage, we have the artifact, and we have the man who was reporting that news.
Nicola Longford is the CEO of the 6th floor museum and says decades later, physical artifacts are still popping up from that moment in time.
We need to have physical items that animate people's imaginations and try to step back into a historic moment.
For Mercer, it's a piece of history that he'll never forget. I mean, what does it mean personally to you, that interview caught on this camera in the museum that talks about that moment?
Well, it's great because what if we hadn't had the camera? It would just be a nothing piece of audio, maybe.
A wrinkle in time somewhere.
That's right.
For CBS Saturday Morning, Omar Villafranca, Dallas.
This lady right here.
The turn of the century saw Theodore Roosevelt and his famous Rough Riders return from the war in Cuba.
In 1898, just before Theodore Roosevelt left for Cuba to fight in the Spanish-American War, his sister Corinne and her husband gave him this silver pocket watch as a gift.
The principles for which we stand.
Roosevelt, still just 3 years away from ascending to the presidency, had the watch with him as he led his Rough Riders to victory in the Battle of San Juan Hill. The token stayed with him during a hunting trip to Africa and while he explored the Amazon. He even mentioned it in his book, Through the Brazilian Wilderness.
What we find remarkable about this photo is this is a silver Waltham pocket watch with a leather strap.
Jonathan Parker is superintendent of Sagamore Hill National Historic Site, Roosevelt's home on Long Island, where the watch is now on display for the first time in decades.
What's remarkable about the watch are the events and the places that President Roosevelt took this watch over the course of his life, both before he became President of the United States, during and after.
The watch had a mysterious 36-year journey after it was taken from a display in Buffalo back in 1987. It showed up at a Florida auction house last year. The owner contacted Sagamore Hill to find out if it was real.
We know from both the physical condition of the watch, the individual and unique markings inside the watch, that it is the watch that was originally here at Sagamore Hill and then loaned to another federal museum in Buffalo, New York, where it was stolen from in 1987.
The FBI returned the watch to the National Park Service last week, and now it appears that its travels are complete, with a permanent display at its owner's former home.
What excites us the most about it is the opportunity for us to share its stories and the stories of Theodore Roosevelt, and how remarkable it would be to ride in the pocket of Theodore Roosevelt, if you will, and be a witness to history.
We've been voting for presidents since George Washington. Most of us make that choice by casting a ballot and telling the results to see who won. But there is another way. Barry Peterson checked out how some people vote on a president's popularity, not with their ballots, but with their bucks.
The saying goes, what's in a name? Well, if your name is George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, we can tell you what's in a name: tens of thousands of dollars.
So this is a letter of Thomas Jefferson from 1781.
Our guide is Nathan Rabb of the Rabb Collection in Philadelphia. Rank for me the American presidents, the most expensive and then down.
Yeah, so I would say the most expensive, the most actively looked for, the most desirable would be George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt,
These men you can see on Mount Rushmore, but you can't hold Mount Rushmore in your hands. What is the attraction, Nathan, of holding something that's got a president's signature on it?
Well, you're touching a piece of history, and it's the only way that we have to directly connect with someone who we may admire. It's something that we know that they touched because they signed it.
And in the presidential collecting world, fame really does mean fortune. Grover Cleveland and George Washington were both American presidents, but
Grover Cleveland, you'd be dealing with something that was several hundred to low thousands. And George Washington, you probably weren't entering the room, so to speak, for under 20, 30,000 and could go up to several million.
Several million?
Yeah, several million.
Abraham Lincoln wasn't a founding father, but he may have been the founding father of collecting presidential autographs. After he was elected, but before he took office, people wrote asking for autographs, and he sent back these signed notes.
He would take the time to write these people, and a lot of them were kids.
And with so much money at stake, forgeries abound. This looks like a Lincoln letter, but see how the sentences taper down. Now, the real thing, with sentences straight across. And when it comes to a Lincoln signature, watch out for the talented Joseph Cozy, who did many of his forgeries in the 20th century.
He may have been paid, it may have been a barter situation where, buy me a beer.
2 whiskeys and you get a Lincoln.
Yes, 3 you get a Washington.
Perhaps the most famous document in American history is the Declaration of Independence. And there seem to be a lot of them.
I would say 5-6 times per week somebody approaches us with the Declaration of Independence.
The Declaration of Independence?
Yes, which would be incredibly valuable if it were authentic. They have reproductions that have aged with time.
What's it like to tell somebody who thinks he has a copy of the Declaration of Independence, which would be worth millions, and say, I'm sorry, but you're not going to be a millionaire?
Well, it's like walking into a buzzsaw. They don't want to hear it.
And modern moments can change the value of the long ago dead, like an obscure Alexander Hamilton. Then came the book and the musical. When they sang his praises, up went his prices.
Yeah, when I joined the business, you could buy Alexander Hamilton's letters for $1,000, $2,000, $3,000. And today, they routinely sell for more than $15,000, $20,000.
Rarity also adds to the price. President William Henry Harrison died 1 month into his term. His signature before taking office might fetch a few $100s. But after taking the oath of office, he didn't have much time to sign anything.
Yeah, he had a month's worth of time to sign documents. A lot of those would have been lost, destroyed, and a handful of them, a very small handful, reached the market.
So how valuable is this signature that I'm holding?
It'd be around $50,000.
$50,000?
Mm-hmm.
Even back in 1861, Lincoln and his top officials knew the value of autographs for raising money during the Civil War. What do you think its purpose was?
It was almost certainly designed to be sold to raise money for the sick and wounded soldiers.
It is one of Rab's most expensive pieces, a cool $300,000. But to many, it's not always about the money. Sometimes the least expensive item can touch the heart as deeply as the most.
The feeling of awe is why people buy these documents. Otherwise, they're just pieces of paper with ink on them.
They died long ago, but that awe really can bring them back to life. For CBS Saturday Morning, Barry Peterson, Philadelphia.
Meantime, this year of indictments, special counsels, and prosecutions of political figures, including a former president, is also a 50th anniversary of sorts. Late 1973 saw the unexpected elevation of Gerald R. Ford to the vice presidency and later to the White House, a presidency defined by how he handled the looming prospect of a very high-stakes prosecution of a former president. As Scott McFarland shows us, the legacy of Gerald Ford and his most consequential decision, the presidential pardon, loom especially large in one Midwestern city.
Just a mile from the river near a bustling downtown, it turns out this old house in this old neighborhood might be the landmark of Grand Rapids, Michigan.
People sometimes just knock on the door and say, hey, we'd love to see you inside.
Oh, there's just people pull up and pictures all over the place.
A labor of love for Rob Kent and Tim England, who bought it 30 years ago and say they're not just the owners, but caretakers too.
There's a moral obligation to making sure that it's kept right. Pictures here.
The house is historic because of the man who grew up here a century ago, America's 38th president.
I have learned already in this office that the difficult decisions always come to this desk.
Gerald R. Ford remains especially meaningful here, with his name plastered all around town. And 50 years after his unlikely ascendance to the vice presidency, no city in America celebrates his brief but tumultuous presidency like his hometown.
President Ford has granted Richard Nixon a, quote, full, free, and absolute pardon.
A presidency perhaps best remembered for one of the most controversial decisions in American history, Ford's pardon of his predecessor, Richard Nixon, who after Watergate and his resignation from the presidency faced the prospect of criminal indictment. Ford spared Nixon, and according to the new president's argument, the nation from the specter of a trial and the political upheaval it would bring.
He came into the office because he was thrust into the position.
Morel Lutke is curator of Ford's Presidential Museum on the downtown riverfront.
He had to know a good chunk of America was going to hate this choice.
He absolutely did know that. Ford recognized that, he acknowledged it, and he still felt that it was the best thing for the country.
The pardon might have ended Ford's political career, cost him the 1976 election, but he said he never regretted it. It's also part of an unprecedented presidency that has made Ford a larger-than-life icon in this Midwestern city. A copy of the pardon is prominently and proudly displayed at the museum.
By pardoning Nixon, he is doing something deeply within character of the American spirit.
So's the pen Ford used to draft it. Even a life-size version of the Oval Office, where Ford made the decision in 1974, and where he received letters blasting or praising that decision.
The sun never shines through.
Including a pat on the back from singer Johnny Cash, who wrote, "Remember that you can't do the will of God without getting a lot of people against you." And handwritten notes from children, including this one, saying Ford was half right and half wrong.
Has America's perspective on this changed in 50 years?
We have begun to kind of see what the larger picture was and where Ford was coming from with the pardoning.
In this politically purple area of a purple state, Stephen Ford maintains his dad captures the political and personal moderation that's common here.
When I look back on Dad's legacy of his very short presidency, same amount of days almost as John F. Kennedy, it's about healing. It's about healing the nation after Watergate, after the Vietnam War. It's about trying to restore some trust in the White House.
In a brutal cold in December 2006, they lined up throughout Grand Rapids to pay final respects at Ford's funeral.
It was about 10 degrees and the line was about 6 hours long.
The love between Ford and Grand Rapids was mutual. He paid a post-presidential visit to that old house, proving he could still draw a crowd, including the new homeowners who say they adore being caretakers of the legacy of a man they call a caretaker president.
He took care of a horrible situation. That's what he had to do.
Not just a controversial decision of American history, but still a rich part of the history in this place that shaped him. For CBS Saturday Morning, Scott McFarland, Grand Rapids, Michigan.
This morning, Max Boot and his new biography, Reagan, His Life and Legend. 10 years plus in the making, it is the most comprehensive biography yet of our 40th president. Ronald Reagan is still a figure both celebrated and scorned. Reading Boot's book may cause you to feel both all over again, no matter what your political leaning.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
You know the greatest hits.
Dovii no provii. Trust but verify.
Actor.
Last town we was in, I had to sit around for 30 days waiting for you to get out of the jug.
Governor.
It's time that some people were reminded that actors are people.
Then president.
Mr. President!
Through an assassination attempt, Iran-Contra.
I do not recall who told me that, but that was the information that I had.
And the end of the Cold War.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
But with the passage of time and access to newly released material, Max Boot believes Ronald Reagan's life deserves new scrutiny.
I'm not sure how much I would have gotten even if I'd been able to sit down and interview Reagan, although I certainly did sit down and interview a lot of his aides. But, you know, I think to really understand Reagan, you kind of have to research around him.
Boot, a former Republican who left the party and now considers himself independent, began this project in 2013. The result? Reagan, his life and legend.
There really was not a great biography of Ronald Reagan, and I felt like there was kind of a gap on the bookshelf that needed to be filled.
Reagan's official biographer, Edmund Morris, got so frustrated by the enigma of the man that he inserted a fictional character and wrote a bizarre book called Dutch. Reagan let almost no one in, except maybe his wife, Nancy.
There was always this kind of inner glacial reserve, so this real distinction between the public, seemingly easygoing, outgoing Reagan and the private man who was actually kind of a loner, kind of a hermit.
He didn't have a lot of friends, and he didn't want a lot of friends.
Exactly right, yeah, because his idea of a great evening was basically sitting with Nancy in front of the TV, watching, you know, Mission Impossible or Bonanza, or maybe sitting down and reading a book. That's all he wanted to do. He didn't really want to go out and socialize.
Ronald Reagan was raised in small towns in Illinois. His dad, an alcoholic salesman, constantly moving the family around. Reagan's mom, Nell, was a frustrated thespian. Reagan's greatest claim to early glory was as a lifeguard who saved dozens of people from drowning. He began to find his voice on the radio before searching for stardom in Hollywood.
Ask them to go in there with all they've got. Win just one for the Kipper.
He found it, with a job that, along with his poor eyesight, allowed him to avoid serving in combat during World War II.
Excuse me, sir, but how could anybody mistake a P-40 for a Zero?
By, among other things, making training films.
Radial engine, oil cooler, air scoop at bottom of nose. It's a Zero, check!
Reagan's thirst for politics was first quenched as leader of the Screen Actors Guild. In that capacity, testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee, the public first got a taste of his hardline anti-communist stance.
We have been eminently successful in preventing them from their usual tactic of trying to run a majority of an organization with a well-organized minority.
The one-time liberal turned conservative, and in the wake of Vietnam, Watergate, and the oil crisis of the 1970s, went on to redefine Republican politics. To this day, some wonder how.
His national security advisor said he knows so little but accomplishes so much.
Yes.
I think that's something a lot of people seem to say. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. I think that is kind of the paradox of Ronald Reagan.
Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said Franklin Roosevelt had a second-class intellect, but a first-class temperament. Of Reagan, many said the same, which may be why he was effective, even as the scorecard is constantly being revised.
I think a lot of the things that he was criticized for when he was in office don't really stand up to much scrutiny or don't have as much resonance today. For example, the biggest Democratic attack on him in the 1980s was that he ran up budget deficits. Well, in the years since then, we've seen much higher budget deficits, and the country has survived. But on the other hand, there are issues today that we're much more sensitized about that were not issues in the 1980s. For example, the fact that Reagan as president largely ignored the AIDS pandemic, didn't address this horrible disease, or he also was very soft on South Africa, and, you know, often catering to white backlash politics. Again, things that were kind of taken for granted in those days, but today look very different.
Whether Boot's book changes your mind is up to the reader. What it does do is give a fresh look at a man who, for better or worse, mattered, according to historians, more than any other president in the last 60 years.
What do you think Ronald Reagan can teach us today?
I think the big thing that Reagan can teach us is to separate campaigning from governing. Because on the campaign trail, Ronald Reagan could be this red-hot conservative. He would push all of the conservative buttons as a campaigner, which is why he was so popular on the right. but he understood the difference between running for office and actually being in office. And although, yes, as governor and president, he cut some taxes, he actually raised taxes a lot too. As governor of California, he passed the most liberal abortion law in the country. As president, he worked with Mikhail Gorbachev, even though a lot of people on the right thought he was being duped by Gorbachev. So I think that was really his genius, was his ability to put his campaign rhetoric aside and do what really worked.
My friends, we did it. We weren't just marking time, we made a difference. We made the city stronger, we made the city freer, and we left her in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all.
It's interesting that so many politicians you see really are desperately just trying to shape their legacy and, craft what they want to be remembered. It didn't seem like Reagan necessarily wanted to. I mean, I'm sure he wanted to be thought of well after he left, but it seemed like he was okay just walking away, and that's what I did.
But I think Nancy was worried
about
for crafting that legacy.
Without question, Nancy played a massive role.
Yes.